was actually captain of the wrestling team in high school. And during wrestling season, every weekend, our team would go to these massive wrestling tournaments, which could have anywhere from 40 to 60 teams present and last up to 3 days. Whenever you would go to these tournaments, there was a certain kind of etiquette that you were expected to follow, unspoken rules about how to act, what to wear, what to bring. For example, on the first day of the tournament, you always show up to the bus on time, at the right weight or underweight, because you're going to have to weigh in and make weight, wearing your school sweats with your wrestling singlet on underneath. Now, the wrestling singlet is that skin-tight leotard that wrestlers wear, and it's also the main reason why most people never join a wrestling team. One year we had a kid named Joey join the team, and Joey showed up to the first tournament not observing the etiquette. Joey showed up overweight, didn't make weight, no bag, no food, no water, no money, and wearing his wrestling singlet and only his wrestling singlet. No sweats covering him up. We had never seen that before, and we said, "Joey, what are you doing? Where are your clothes, buddy?" And he said, "Nobody explained that to me," which technically was my fault because I was captain of the wrestling team. Poor Joey had a long, cold, uncomfortable weekend. But have you ever been in a situation where everyone seems to understand what's going on and why, except you? It can be uncomfortable, confusing, embarrassing. And I wonder how many people have that experience the first time they go to church. What are we doing when we gather here on Sunday mornings? So this morning, what I want to do is I want to help explain what we're doing and why when we gather to worship on Sunday mornings. And the big question for today is, what is worship and why is it important? Because everything we do when we gather is about worship, the fellowship, the preaching, the singing, the prayers, the offering. It all revolves around this idea of worship. So it seems to be a pretty important thing to understand what's going on. Now, the word worship comes from the Old English word worthship, and it means worth or worthiness. So worship is the act of ascribing ultimate value to something that engages your whole being, your mind, heart, and will. To worship something or someone is to make it the primary object of your deepest devotion, your first allegiance, total adoration. It's the thing beyond love. To worship is to adore with your whole being. Now, of course, as Christians, we're called to worship God individually on our own time, but something special, something unique happens when we gather as a church on Sunday morning for corporate worship. As Jesus says, when 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there in their midst. Something special is happening right now. But here's the deal. Whether it's your first Sunday ever, and if it is, I just want to say, awesome. It takes a lot of courage to come to church for the first time. Or if it's your 1,000th Sunday ever, the truth is there's a lot of confusion in our world today about what worship is all about. So this morning as we look at Psalm 96, we're going to ask these questions. When we worship, who are we worshiping? How do we worship? And why we worship? First, who are we worshiping? Our text says in verse 9, worship the Lord in holy splendor. Now that original word for Lord in the Hebrew language is actually the name that God gives himself when he first reveals himself to Moses in the form of a burning bush in the book of Exodus, chapter 3. And that name, scholars believe, is pronounced Yahweh. God said to Moses, "This is my name forever. This is my title for all generations. My name is Yahweh." And essentially means the one who is. It's connected to the verb to be. The God says of himself, I am who I am. And it signifies the truth that God is not an abstract idea or a passive, inanimate object, but Yahweh, God is alive. He, the one who is, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the one who was and is to come. And the name not only tells us that God is personal and knowable, but it tells us that it's a God who wants to be known, a God who has revealed himself in history, time, and space. And the other thing that God tells Moses in Exodus 3 when he reveals himself to him, he says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And what does this do? It means that the person of God and the acts of God and the people that God has interacted with in history is a God who is involved, a God who has shown himself to be involved in history. And for us, what that means is that when we worship God as Yahweh, we're worshiping a God who is known throughout history and who has revealed himself in the Bible. We worship the God of the Bible. Now maybe you're sitting there thinking, duh. Like, of course we worship the God of the Bible, Dan. What are you talking about? Well, let me just tell you right now, there are actually plenty of churches, especially here in the West, that don't want to worship the God of the Bible. A number of years ago, a prominent evangelical leader and a mega church pastor said that the church needs to unhitch itself from the Old Testament. More recently, a mainline denominational leader said that the church needs to write a third testament because the Bible is far too problematic. Now, I just want to say this. Of course, there are challenging things in the Bible. There are weird things in the Bible. And if you ever want to talk about the weird stuff in the Bible, that's one of my favorite conversation topics. I love getting into the weirdness. But I just want to tell you that I ascribe to the position of this: keep it challenging. Keep it weird. Because we cannot rewrite a version of God that is sanitized to our own modern day preferences. Because the truth is, that's not a real relationship. The God of the Bible challenges us, shapes us, confronts us, because the truth is we are sinful, fallen people, and God is a holy, all-knowing, all-powerful God. And if you can't allow the God of the Bible to challenge you from time to time, you don't have a real relationship with a living God. You have a relationship with a God that you have created in your own image, one that you prefer, one that you like. But that's just another form of idolatry, isn't it? We worship the God of the Bible, God who has revealed himself in history, time, and space, and we find those events in the record of Scripture. Be careful of the God that you choose to worship. Be careful not to create God in your image. Or as our psalm says in verse 4, great is Yahweh. He is to be revered above all gods, small g gods. He's the only one worthy of worship. Now maybe you're sitting there skeptically thinking, okay, why do I have to worship anything or anybody? Maybe I just want to go through life happily not being one who worships anything. To that I will say this: everybody worships something. Everybody worships something. Every person has something that is the center of your world. The thing that if it is taken away from you, your entire existence falls apart. You don't have a choice whether or not you will worship. The only choice you have is what you will worship. So be careful what you choose to worship. Be careful what you allow to become the center of your world. Bible scholar N.T. Wright says this: when human beings give their heartfelt allegiance to and worship that which is not God, they progressively cease to reflect the image of God. One of the laws of human life is that you become like what you worship. So if you worship money, that becomes your God. You're going to become a person who views and interacts with all people, seeing them as creditors or debtors. If you worship sex, you'll eventually be a person who treats all people like objects or less than. You'll be rating people. If you choose to worship success, you'll start to treat other people as competitors, people who are in the way of your goal. Be careful what you choose to worship. And remember, the God of the Bible is the only God worthy of your worship. As our psalm says, ascribe to Yahweh the glory due His name. But how do we worship? That's who we worship. How do we worship? We worship with our whole selves, our whole being. Remember, worship is ascribing ultimate value to something or someone that engages your whole self, body, mind, soul, heart. Or as Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Now, the problem with worship, especially here in Western churches, is that we often don't worship God with our whole selves. Oftentimes, we're going to worship God with only a part of ourselves. For example, some churches focus on worshiping God with just their heart, and other churches might focus on worshiping God with just their mind. For some churches, the churches that, it's all about feelings and emotion and the heart. Worship is about hitting an emotional high. So every service that you go to in certain kinds of churches, everything that is put together in the service, the lights, the music, the preaching, it's all designed to control and manipulate emotions. I once heard this pastor who visited a big, famous megachurch with his son, and after they were leaving, his son said, Dad, why did they have fog machines in service? And the dad said, well, how else are you going to see the lasers? You need the fog machine, you see. But everything is used to create some kind of emotional experience. It becomes a high that you're chasing. But the danger with that kind of worship is, what do you do when you can't hit that emotional high anymore? A relationship with God that is only emotional is like a marriage that starts to kind of fall apart as soon as that honeymoon phase is over. Eugene Peterson once said that emotions are not reliable indicators for how close God is to us at any given time. There are moments where God doesn't feel close to us, but that doesn't make it so. He says this in his book, The Long Obedience in the Same Direction. Peterson writes, feelings are great liars. If Christians worshiped only when they felt like it, there would be precious little worship. And Jesus warns about this kind of faith, a faith built strictly on emotions, when he tells the parable of the sower. He says, a farmer went out to sow his seed. Some seed fell on the path, some fell on the rocky ground, some fell on the thorns, some fell on good soil. But he says this about the seed that falls on the rocky ground. He says, these are the ones, when they hear the word, they immediately receive it with joy. But they have no root, and they endure only for a while. Be wary when your faith is only emotion. But on the flip side of that, be wary when there is no emotion. Some churches, all it is worshiping God with the mind. It's theoretical. It's abstract. Maybe it's all liturgy or theology or dogma or ritual. But this is just as problematic as the other option. Because if you never feel anything, if you never have a moment that cuts you to your heart, if you never have any kind of emotional response, then my question is, are you really considering the magnificence of God's grace for you? If it, every once in a while, doesn't just make you tremble, then are you really taking a good look at God? Be wary of the faith that has no emotion. A faith without no emotion is like a marriage with no passion. Worship ought to engage the whole self, mind, heart, and will. As our psalm says, sing to the Lord a new song. Let the whole earth rejoice. Worship the Lord in holy splendor and tremble before Him. You remember that old song? Sometimes when I think about the crucifixion, it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Worship the Lord with mind, heart, and will. I also want to point out one other issue that I have with, and I hope this sermon isn't coming off as me just like complaining about a lot of things, but there's that possibility. But another issue that I see with worship in Western churches is that it's becoming increasingly consumeristic. With our capitalist economy, we're trained to look at life as consumers. In his book, Being Consumed, William Cavanaugh says, consumerism is a restless spirit that is never content. And as the church adopts this consumeristic mindset in worship, churches start treating congregants as customers, and other churches as competitors. The problem with this consumeristic shift is that it's hurting all of us. Pastors are turned into salesmen who live under this constant maxim, the customer is always right. I got to keep the customers happy. And if pastors do that, that will absolutely erode any form of preaching with conviction. Consumeristic faith hurts pastors and it hurts community because people start showing up with a consumer mindset and church becomes all about what am I getting out of it? As opposed to what am I bringing of myself to offer God or these people that God has called me to love. It hurts the pastors, it hurts community, it hurts individuals because discipleship is no longer the goal in consumer-driven churches. You're just a customer. You're just a critic who's going to sit there and rate and review the performance that we call church, as opposed to being an active participant in the life of the community. How do you know if you're turning into a consumer Christian? It's when you start asking the question after church, what have they done for me lately? Or what am I getting out of it? I didn't get anything out of it today. Be careful. Instead, pray to God, what did I bring to the Lord today? What did I give of myself to God today? Biblical worship is not consumer-driven, it is sacrificial. Our psalm says, ascribe to the Lord the glory due His name. Bring an offering when you come into His courts. The language of offering comes from the book of Leviticus. There were five primary types of offering in Leviticus: burnt offerings, grain offerings, peace offerings, sin offerings, and guilt offerings. And every time when you would bring an offering to God, you would bring the best of your crops or the best of your flocks. We have to have a shift in our mindset in worship today. We got to stop asking the question, what am I getting out of it? And start praying, Lord, what can I give you today? What can I offer you today? And if you have that mindset when you come through these doors, I promise you, it'll be a completely different experience. And you'll find the Holy Spirit doing things in your heart that you never thought possible. Worship engages the whole self, body, mind, and soul. Paul says in Romans chapter 12, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual act of worship. What do we bring as an offering? We all have something to offer. What do we bring? Time, resources, finances, gifts, abilities, talents, praise, thanksgiving. listening to your neighbor, checking in on someone, showing up, saying, Lord, what can I do for this community today? And when it's all done in devotion to God, you know what that is? That's worship. And it's incredibly beautiful. Psalm 50 says, offer to God a sacrifice of thanksgiving. What do we bring when we worship the Lord? Not, what will I get? We worship with our mind, our heart, and our will. And lastly, why do we worship? This question of why is so important because many people approach church and worship, especially here in the West, as transactional. They consciously or they subconsciously think, if I go to church, if I tithe my money, if I'm a good person, then God will bless me and protect me and take care of me. I will prosper. I'll have good health. My kids will turn out fine. Everything will go the way I want it because I am going to church. But do you know what that is? It's a form of quid pro quo. This for that. If you scratch my back, God, I'll scratch your back. And what it really is an attempt to control God. A.W. Tozer says, we want a God that we can control. But is that really worship? That's why a lot of people go to church. If I do this, God will bless me. But the story of Job completely turns that on its head, does it not? You read in the Bible the story of Job. Job was a righteous man, blameless and upright. Turned from evil. He did what was good. He went to church. He tithed. He did everything right. And not only did he worship and make offerings for himself, but he made offerings for his kids, just in the slight chance, in the secret of their own heart, they happen to offend God, he's going to offer for them too. Job was such a good person that when Satan comes into God's court in the book of Job, God says, have you seen Job? He's awesome. When God starts bragging about you, that says something. God says, there's no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. Job did everything right, and he still suffered. He lost his wealth, his health, even his children. You can do everything right. You can come to church, but you cannot control God. True worship is never transactional. It's surrender. We read in verse 10, say among the nations, the Lord is king. A better translation of that verse would be, the Lord our God reigns. He is supreme. He is in charge. You can't control him. Remember what Mr. Tumnus says of Aslan in the book The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? He says, Aslan is not a tame lion. You can't control him. I added that part in. What does Mr. Beaver say of Aslan? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good, and he's the king, as it is with God. You cannot control God, but he is good. God is the ultimate good, and that is the reason why we worship God. Verse 2 says, tell of his salvation from day to day. The word for salvation, or for telling of his salvation in the original Hebrew language, it's a word for herald. A herald who would come and bring good tidings or good news. Like when your army wins a great victory and your country is protected and safe, you would tell of it through a herald. Or when a new king would be born, you would tell of it through a herald. In Greek, that word is translated into euangelion, which is where we get the word evangelism, which is where we get the word gospel, which is where we get the words good news. And true worship really only happens when you start to understand the good news in your own heart. That the God of the universe, with all of his magnificence and glory, this God you just read about in Psalm 96, that this God, who is so big, who's so powerful, is not content just watching you stew in your own self-hatred, your own self-destruction, your own sin. God was not content to just sit by and let it happen, but like a loving parent whose child has run away, God is the one who pursues you. You not get that? The God of the universe is pursuing you? Should that not make us tremble? To show how much he loves for us, he came, put on flesh, to show us how to live, how to be, how to love. The God of the universe humbled himself and suffered a horrible, agonizing, shameful, terrible death that was reserved for criminals and traitors. And he did it for the sake of love, the God of the universe. And when you understand the depth of God's grace and love for you, then you start to understand why we worship. Which is why Paul so often prays in the New Testament, I pray that you would understand the height, the depth, the greatness of how much God just loves you. Because when you start to get that into our tiny, finite brains, worship is the only response we can have. I saw this quote this last week that struck me, and it said this. It said, you know those parts of yourself that you hate the most? Jesus died for those parts of you as well. Or as Scripture says, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. He became sin who knew no sin so that we might become the righteousness of God. If that doesn't do something emotionally, mentally, or physically to us every once in a while, then are we really worshiping? John Newton, you know his story. Slave trader. Slave catcher. Worst possible kind of human you could be, right? Spend a majority of his life on a boat going around the continent of Africa, stealing and buying and selling human beings. Even John Newton's shipmates on that slave ship thought he was a wretch. But after a miraculous encounter with God during a storm, when John Newton thought he was going to die, he called out to God and he prayed. And God answered and spared him that night. John Newton gave up his life as a slave trader and he became a minister, and he eventually wrote those words that we sang this morning, or at least a version of it. But the old version, you know these words. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils, and snares I have already come. 'Tis grace has brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. I remember hearing a story about one of my mentors was a police officer, and he was trying to witness to a fellow police officer in his place of work. And one day, they were having these conversations, and the fellow said, I'm not interested in Christianity. I don't believe in God. I don't want to hear about it. A few days go by. They're at a special event, a formal function, and there's a rendering of Amazing Grace that somebody sings. And my mentor, goes to church. He looks over and he sees this non-Christian police officer hearing those words, just starting to weep, just starting to cry. And my mentor goes up to him afterwards. He says, I noticed that you were weeping during that song. What was that all about? And he just said, there's something about that song. I can't explain it, but I just feel this love that I don't deserve. That's it right there. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound. I pray that each and every one of us will come to hear that sound in our own lives. And let's worship the Lord. Let's pray.